What is going on, everybody? This is James Krasnerick here, back with another live podcast of Real Still Sports on Spreaker Web Radio. I hope everybody's having a phenomenal day, as am I. And I figured this would be a pretty good time. It's early meeting, just a minute past 7 here in southwestern PA. And I figured it'd be a great time to discuss the next segment on my top 100 analysis list. I have previously broken down the quarterbacks and running back lists. You can always go ahead and check those out. But today I'm going to talk about the most glamorous quote-unquote position in the NFL, the wide receiver position. And this is one list that upon looking up and down it, I'm honestly not sure I would change a whole lot with it. But let's get started. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Number 83 is Jordy Nelson for the Packers. Number 80 is Pierre Garçon of the Redskins. Number 73 is Broncos Wes Welker. 63 is former Eagle, now Redskin Deshaun Jackson. 54 is Alshon Jeffrey of the Bears. 49 is Demaryius Thomas of the Broncos. 44 is Vincent Jackson of the Buccaneers. 38, Larry Wilson. 36, Brandon Marshall of the Bears. 25, the Cowboys' Dez Bryant. 23, Antonio Brown of the Steelers, repping the black and yellow, or the black and gold, whichever fits your fancy. Number 21 is Andre Johnson of the Texans. Number 16 is Josh Gordon of the Browns. 9, A.J. Green of the Bengals. And 2, Calvin Johnson for the Lions. Starting off, I'm not so sure that I would change any of the top two. I think that right now, Calvin Johnson is easily the best receiver in the National Football League. And it's really not even that close of a margin. Because when you stop and think about it, Calvin Johnson's numbers the last few years have just been utterly ridiculous. If you hear that in the background, that's just me typing. Alright, here's what Calvin Johnson has done since 2011. Since 2011, Calvin Johnson has accumulated 5,137 receiving yards on 302 catches for 33 touchdowns. That is 111.7 yards per game, 17 yards a catch. It's ridiculous what he's been putting up. His last 3 years have been probably one of the best 3-year spans a wide receiver has ever had in the history of this game. And the fact is, he even missed 2 games as well. So if you factor those 2 games in 2013, he probably would have had over 1,700 yards receiving again. It's not a far-fetched cry to make it, because all he would have had to do was accumulate 208 yards. It's ridiculous how well he's played. I cannot disagree with him being the number 1 receiver on this list. If I could disagree with any receiver's position on this list, it would have to be Josh Gordon's. I know you look at Josh Gordon last year, he led the league in receiving. And he was named an All-Pro. And last year, he was arguably the number 2 wide receiver in the league. 1,646 yards and 9 touchdowns with absolutely no relevancy at quarterback and no consistency at that position. My problem with Josh Gordon being ranked the 16th best player in the league is that the list puts players ahead of players who've accomplished more and are still playing well. I would not put Josh Gordon above Brandon Marshall. I would not put him above Demaryius Thomas. I wouldn't put him above Antonio Brown. And I wouldn't put him above Andre Johnson. So if we're going to talk a spot for Josh Gordon, I think the fan rank is pretty appropriate. He's ranked 45th by the fans, and I'd say dropping him a few spots down is pretty much worth it. Up next, coming in at number 9, is A.J. Green of the Bengals. Again, I mean, you can argue who the number 2 wide receiver in the NFL is. For my personal opinion, it's Andre Johnson, but A.J. Green is as good as any, and he's been so consistent since he came into the league a couple years ago. If you look at the numbers that he's put in and the way that he's played, he's been to 3 Pro Bowls. And if you look at his career average of 81.6 yards per game receiving, it's pretty impressive. And he's accumulated 29 touchdowns. Very, very much a good career to start. But I don't think you could put him quite above Andre Johnson yet. Maybe close, but I still think Andre's got the best. Antonio Brown, I think, was given a very generous position by the voters. I wouldn't have put him higher than Ben Roethlisberger. I think Ben Roethlisberger is more important to the Steelers than Antonio Brown is, and I don't think there's a person who will disagree with that. But when you look at it from the perspective I'm looking at, as a receiver, I think he's one of the top 4 receivers in this league because think about it. Yes, he's probably got one of the better quarterbacks. I mean, let's put it this way. If you compare the other big 3 receivers in the league, A.J. Green, Andre Johnson, Calvin Johnson, they got to deal with Andy Dalton, Matt Stafford, and I don't even know who's going to be the quarterback for the Texans. Look like Ryan Fitzpatrick. Nothing to even come close. Not a playoff win between the 3 of them, and Ben Roethlisberger's got 2 Super Bowls and another appearance. So he's got the best quarterback, but the thing you have to remember is that A.J. Green is pretty tall. Calvin Johnson's ridiculously athletic. Antonio Brown can do so many things, and he is a much better return man than those guys. As a player, I think he deserves to be ranked second to Calvin Johnson, but as a receiver, I'd say ranking him a comfortable 4th behind Johnson, Green, and on Calvin, on A.J. Green, and Andre Johnson would be pretty fair. The next problem I have with this list is Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant's been playing very well for the last couple years. If you look at his last 2 years, and you look at what he's accomplished, the last 2 seasons he's accumulated 2,615 receiving yards on 185 catches for a grand total of 25 touchdowns. That's almost a touchdown per game, and it's over 81 yards a game. Very, very consistent numbers, very, very productive player. But what I think about Dez Bryant is I still don't think he's better than guys like Larry Fitzgerald and Brandon Marshall. I just don't think so. I think that those guys, the fans rank them higher than him, I think, for a reason. Dez has still got a long way to go mentally between the ears. And the other thing is that I had him in fantasy football in 2013. And he had 2 or 3 really good games, but other than that, when I played him, he did not perform well at all. The reason why I said it in that context is I was in a 3-team league. It was weird, but back to the story here. Dez Bryant, I think, is still a little bit overrated by this list. I think that the problem with him being this high is that he's ahead of guys that have accomplished so much more and that are still playing well, such as Brandon Marshall. I think Brandon Marshall is one of the top 5 receivers in this league. I really do, because he has put up some incredible numbers, and he's so talented. He can do just about everything. And the fact is that it probably makes him the toughest matchup for anybody in the NFL aside from Calvin Johnson, is just how physical he is. Calvin can beat you with his jumping and with his speed. Brandon Marshall just beats you by he just blows right past you. He's so physical and strong. He's like a bigger, stronger version of Hines Ward. Doesn't block as well, but still. Alshon Jeffrey was a nice surprise. I'd say he's probably a couple spots too high. I think the fan rank's appropriate. I'm not really sure how Demaryius Thomas is so low. Because if you look at his numbers, particularly last year, the last 2 years, he has accumulated almost 2,900 receiving yards and 24 touchdowns. So he's been as consistent as anybody, averaging almost 89 yards, averaging almost over 89 yards per game the last 2 years. Let's not forget he had a record-setting Super Bowl with the most catches by anybody in the Super Bowl. I believe it was 14 or 13 in that realm. But I think he's a little lower. I don't think Vincent Jackson should be so high, because Vincent Jackson is a good receiver, but he doesn't have the talent, skills, or any of those other things. He's really fast, and he's really tall, but other than that, he's a yards after catch guy, and mostly down the field. Those are really, beneficial to his abilities, but if you look at his numbers over the past years, they're starting to dip a little bit, and even when he was in San Diego, he was still merely just an average receiver. I would have to move Vincent Jackson probably a couple spots down, below Demaryius Thomas, I think. If we look at the final 4 on this list that I haven't really mentioned, DeSean Jackson, Wes Welker, Pierre Garçon, and Jordy Nelson. If you look at what they've done, we'll start with Jordy Nelson, because he's been in the news for getting a contract extension. Does he deserve $10 million a year? Absolutely not. But I think it's still good to analyze his abilities and see where we go. Now, Jordy Nelson last year, 1,314 yards and 8 touchdowns in 16 games. Pretty impressive season. And actually, it's made more impressive by the fact that Aaron Rodgers wasn't there for half the year. So he had to pretty much do that with some backups. And that has actually made his numbers even more impressive. In 2011, he had his best season, 1,263 yards and 15 scores. And he's been really, really consistent the past few years. It's just last year, in 2012, there was a little bit of a dip in his production. But he did have some injury problems. That definitely held him back. But I think Jordy Nelson, if we're talking about the list, him having in number 83, I think maybe dropping number 90. I think of all the guys on this list, he's the guy who's probably the least. He deserves to be on this list the least. But I still think he's definitely worthy of being mentioned. Pierre Garçon was an average receiver for 4 years with the Colts. Had a good year with Washington the year before, and then last year exploded with 113 catches. Garçon's a very good receiver, leading the league with 113 receptions. But his touchdown totals are average, and he doesn't get very many yards after the catch. You look at his career in Washington, 12.6 yards after the catch. His career in general, 13. Not very... I apologize, my house phone went off. Sorry about that, everybody. But, give me a minute. Forgot to take the battery out of that phone. I usually never forget to do that. But, back to Garçon. He's a good receiver, doesn't generate much yards after the catch. He's not a very tall guy. He's kind of thick he's kind of thick for a short receiver. He's kind of built more muscularly. He's pretty physical, so it's a big plus. But at the same time, he's a lot like Hines Ward, so if that's the case, I really got to praise him. But he is known to drop some passes at times. He is known to drop some passes, and that's just if you look in the Super Bowl against the Saints, he had a couple of key drops. This year for the Redskins, he had a couple of key drops. I'd have to say his spot on this list is probably deserved to be in the top 100, but again, rank him at number 8 I think is a little high, and I think he's a little undeserving of being silently mentioned so early. Wes Welker is a guy who I think is severely underrated. I know he played with Demaryius Thomas and Eric Decker and Julius Thomas and Peyton Manning this year, and obviously he got overshadowed, but even with all those guys, he had 73 catches and 10 touchdowns. But Welker's never been a big, yards per reception guy. He's usually been a big yards after the catch guy. I mean, I look at Welker right now as being probably the most underrated receiver in NFL history. You look at him and you think, wow, 5'9", 190 pounds. You would never think of a guy like that could potentially be a 10,000-yard receiver. But if he accumulates 642 yards this year, he'll beat 10,000 for his career, and that's very likely in this offense. It's funny because looking at his spot at number 73, I think he deserves to be ranked above Nelson and Garçon, but now we got to talk about the other guy, and that's DeSean Jackson. DeSean Jackson, of course, making the Pro Bowl last year with career highs in receiving touchdowns, receiving yards, and receptions, and 16.2 yards per reception. Very, very talented receiver. But the problem with DeSean Jackson is that there are times where he's very inconsistent, and he'll show up for some games, and he'll have some big games, even as a returner. But on average, there will be times where he'll explode in big games, but there will be times where he is almost invisible. And if you look at some of the games you look at some of the fact that he's played in some playoff games in his career, and it's not like he's gone against some top-notch defenses either. He's played in 6 postseason games. He's averaged just over 50 yards per game. Let's look at the teams he's gone against. They went against the Minnesota team in 2008-2009, his rookie year. He had 1 catch. Against the Giants next week, somewhat stronger defense, 4 catches. Against the Cardinals, again, a respectable 6 for 92 yards and a touchdown. If you just look at his evolution in big games, he does not play well. And even this year against the Saints, he had 3 catches for 53 yards. Now, that may seem impressive. But if you look at that, one of them was a 40-yard catch. So basically, he had 2 catches for 13 yards, and then 1 got open for 40. I remember that was a long throw. My take is that he's a very, very talented playmaker, and he can return a lot. But I'd have to say of those 4 guys, I'd say he's probably below Nelson and Welker as pure receivers, but ahead of Garcon. But again, in looking at this list, I still think a couple things that we'll all agree with as watchers and fans of the NFL that Calvin Johnson is the best wide receiver in the game, and I don't think there's much to dispute that until another guy comes along or some other guy in the league steps up. I don't really think there's much you can do. I think Dez Bryant's a little overrated. I think Josh Gordon is very overrated. And again, if you just look at the guy, I mean, yeah, he's quick and can make some catches, and he's a good deep threat. But let's put it this way: there's another guy that plays for the Miami Dolphins that I know very well that played for the Steelers for a few years. That was the same mold. Came onto the scene in the AFC North very quick and took the league by storm for a few years, and that was Mike Wallace. But once teams figure out how to cover Mike Wallace and not give him room over the top, he completely downgraded. And I think that'll eventually happen to Josh Gordon because he doesn't look like he's much more than a glorified Mike Wallace at this point. I think Andre deserves to be bumped up a few. The fact that he's had some great years with Matt Schaub, who's been average, and they had T.J. Yates in there for a while. He was average, and Johnson still got some yards. But other than that, there's not a whole lot wrong with this list. I think the guys on this list that were mentioned were all worthy of being on this list. But if I had to pick one guy who's not a top 100 player in the NFL, I'd probably have to pick Pierre Garcon. Yeah, he led the league in receptions, but then again, that Redskin team hardly had any other options other than Jake Reed to throw to. So it's not like they had that much to go on. Let's see. Now, if we look at other receivers who could have potentially been on this list, if you look at a lot of the names, I think they pretty much, got everything covered in terms of who should have been on this list because there really aren't that many notable omissions. Eric Decker could be looked at as a notable omission, possibly Anquan Bolden or Torrey Smith. But if I had to pick one guy that I thought was quite a surprising omission, it was Keenan Allen. And that Keenan Allen had such a phenomenal rookie year for a wide receiver. And I'm trying to look it up right now. Since 1992, minimum of 50 catches, the top receiving seasons since that year, ironically enough my birth year, you look at where Keenan Allen ranked, he had 1,046 yards. That would put him as the 6th best from that time period. That's pretty impressive. He had a good rookie year. But when you just look at the rest of this list, there aren't too many great notable omissions. I do think that, honestly, there's one guy that I do believe actually should have been removed from this list the more I thought about it, and that was Larry Fitzgerald. I didn't realize, after looking at his stats being that bad, I mean, it's obviously of all the guys that were on the top 100 list, he had the fewest receiving yards in terms of wide receivers, but I'm going to go ahead and say on record that if we were going to move one guy that was not on the list onto the list, I think a safe bet to move on this list would probably be Anquan Bolden. He's still got it. At 33 years old, I mean, he's still catching the ball like it's nothing. Great hands, physical, just really strong. And you look at him, he plays in an offense with the San Francisco 49ers that Crabtree's average, very average. Kaepernick's not a great thrower, and yet then Bolden still gets some good numbers. So that's just how I feel about that. But overall, everybody, that's how I feel about the top 100 receivers list. I think that this list probably, I know the players do vote on, they vote on every list, but if you look at the fan rank, the fan rank goes like this. The number 1 receiver is Calvin Johnson, number 2 is Wes Welker, number 3 is A.J. Green, 4 is Fitzgerald, and 5 is Thomas. Sometimes the fans are right, and sometimes they're not. And I would have to say that my opinions are just ultimately looking at this list. I'm going to be very honest. It was a good list. I thought there were some guys that overachieved more than some other guys and are still better than some younger guys. But overall, I'm not really too upset. I think it was a very good job. But that is all I have to say on that. I hope you enjoyed listening. I'll be coming back very shortly tonight. I'll also be doing the top 100 for tight ends. I will probably go a little more in depth with that one than I did with the receiver ones, because think about it, there's so many receivers in the NFL on this list. I believe there are 16 or 15 on this list, and it's just so tough to talk about them all. But tight ends, I don't think it should be a big problem. There's only 5 of them. So, hope you guys enjoyed it. I will be back very shortly. James Generic, over and out.